Thank you, everybody. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we're on the traditional territory of the Ton-Quechan Council and the Kwantlen Dun First Nation. My name is Scott Smith. I'm a partner at Gowling WLG, and I just really wanted to thank the conference organizers for asking me to come and speak with you today and share some of my experiences working with Indigenous peoples across Canada. One of the great pleasures that I have in the job that I get to do is working on major natural resource and energy infrastructure projects across Canada. And today, I'm hoping to share some of those experiences with you. So whenever I give presentations, I always sort of like to get right to what I call the take-home message or what I'm trying to convey to the audience. And I think there's going to be three key points that I'm going to make throughout the next 20 minutes. The first is we've got a wonderful international instrument in the form of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And we really need to use the Declaration as a framework for reconciliation moving forward. So you'll see in my presentation the Truth and Reconciliations calls to action, ask us to do that or demand that we do that. There's going to be you'll see a movement across Canada now to adopt and implement the Declaration. And it's really a basic human rights document that is so critical to the work we want to do, and in particular to informing how, as a natural resource sector and the mining sector, we're going to engage with Indigenous people. So I'm going to talk to you about some of those trends. The second trend, and I was able to listen to a couple of the presentations before, and what unique opportunities we have in the Yukon to partner with Indigenous communities, right? So 2 panels ago, we heard about connecting the Yukon grid, a new transmission line. What a wonderful opportunity to have a First Nation owned and constructed and operated transmission line to service the mining sector. And what you're going to hear over the next 20 minutes is an increasing trend that we're seeing across Canada of equity participation by First Nations and Indigenous peoples in major natural resource and energy projects. And you heard in the last presentation a little bit about red tape and that kind of stuff. In my experience, equity is the best way to align Indigenous and non-Indigenous business interests, provides for a much smoother regulatory process. In the mining sector, of course, we're really concerned about risk and minimizing risk. Equity participation is the best way to do that. And I'll argue that will also provide you with significant competitive advantages. Now, there's been a lot of talk about, well, how as industry do we go about implementing and the declaration? Is it possible? All these challenges, et cetera. Well, equity participation is probably the single biggest indicator that your project is both compliant with the Declaration and reflects that you have the consent of the Indigenous peoples on whose lands you're planning on operating. So those are the 3 key takeaways from the presentation. As I mentioned, I'm going to walk through some of the recent trends we're seeing in the recognition and implementation of Indigenous rights across Canada and what that means for the mining sector. We're going to look at TRC Call to Action 92, which is the call to action that tells us that we need to use the Declaration as a framework for moving towards reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. And you might be asking yourself, well, how do I do that? We're going to cover some of that ground today to the extent we can in 20 minutes. This is really something that's probably deserving in your next forum of several panels and several hours of discussion. I'm then going to finish with an overview of the recent trends in resource partnerships and talk to you about the many success stories that we're achieving across Canada, having First Nations gain equity interest in major natural resource and energy projects. So I've got lots of examples of transmission lines, natural gas facilities. In British Columbia, we're now seeing the Haisla Nation and the Nisga'a Nation lead the development of liquefaction facilities on the coast, and there are more of those to come. Okay, so nationally and internationally, we're seeing a movement for governments, whether they be federal, provincial, territorial governments, to enact enabling legislation to implement the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So federally in Canada, the Parliament recently passed what's called the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act. Among other things, that act provides that the declaration is a framework for reconciliation. So that's one of the themes that you're going to hear a lot about over the next 20 minutes. Sets out the minimum standards for the survival, dignity, and well-being of Indigenous peoples of the world. So really, the standards in the declaration are fundamental human rights that are the absolute floor or minimum for any projects moving forward and for engaging with Indigenous peoples. Thirdly, the Act provides that it's a universal international human rights instrument that applies in Canadian law. Similarly, I spend a lot of my time in British Columbia. I live in Coast Salish territories in North Vancouver. I'm sure a lot of people in the audience are familiar with what the government of British Columbia has been up to. So they've passed a similar act to the federal act that's called the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act, which has similar purposes, including to affirm that the declaration now applies to the laws of British Columbia. So this is what we're seeing both federally and provincially, and that this is going to be an increasing trend, and it will be coming to the Yukon. It's not a matter of if, I think it's a matter of when. And there's a real opportunity for the Yukon government to adopt the declaration as its framework for moving forward with reconciliation and really be leading the way in Canada. So what we've seen as a result of this movement of rights recognition and implementation is increasing Indigenous participation in key decision-making processes. And this is really one of the ways where equity participation can align Indigenous and non-Indigenous business interests. So I've got a couple of examples. I'm going to speak about one in particular. So a couple of months ago, the government of British Columbia and the Tahltan Nation announced the first Section 7 DRIPA agreement. So DRIPA, again, is the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act. Section 7 gives the province the legislative authority to enter into consent or joint-based decision-making. And this agreement, which is a fabulous agreement, is the first of its kind where the Tahltan will be provided the opportunity to provide their consent in relation to the Eskay Creek mine and whether or not it can go ahead. So this is the kind of thing we're seeing in British Columbia. There'll be another announcement in the very near future about a Section 7 agreement. This is where we're going. And I think it's a really good thing. And what it's going to do is it's helping put Indigenous people in their rightful place again, reassuming jurisdiction over their territories. And what that'll mean, from my perspective, is increased certainty in regulatory processes, but we're also going to see projects now that better align with Indigenous values. So there's been a lot of talk about climate change. The last panel was talking about some of the emissions reduction targets that need to be achieved. All roads to net zero run through Indigenous territories. There's been a number of conferences recently, both in British Columbia and Canada, that have spoken to that issue. And what we're going to see is really Indigenous people leading the way in helping us hit our emissions reduction targets. And this is going to play out in terms of the panel that we just listened to and the mining sector and the electrification, the need for infrastructure, et cetera. These are very good developments that we all need to be proud of and continue to accelerate moving forward. So just a little bit now about TRC Call to Action 92 and the ongoing trend that is going to just continue to increase in momentum of rights recognition and implementation. So what this is going to require is nothing short of a transformation or a paradigm shift in the mining sector to sort of leave the days behind. And you know, I heard some of these words that are kind of trigger words for me, like consultation and accommodation, impacted communities. Indigenous people, we need to partner with them. They need to start leading this critical development of infrastructure. And TRC Call to Action 92 really provides the guidance in terms of where we're going. So there's a lot of words on this slide here. What I'd really like you to focus on is what I've underlined. So the declaration is a framework for reconciliation. And then in the sub-I there, obtaining the free, prior, and informed consent. Not trying to get consent, not sort of getting consent half the time. We need to be focused on obtaining consent before moving forward. So there's a number of articles in the declaration. I've highlighted the two most relevant for our purposes today. Article 32, which states that the free, prior, and informed consent of Indigenous people must be obtained prior to resource development happening on their territory, and Article 28, which provides for redress, including restitution, where resources have been taken or used without FPIC having been achieved. So here's the crux of, in my view, implementing TRC Call to Action 92. So as I mentioned, it requires a fundamental paradigm shift. So what does that involve? It involves starting from the position that Indigenous peoples own the resources, their laws apply to regulate them, Indigenous governing bodies will make decisions about how those resources will be used, and their consent is required. So what does that mean for us as the mining sector in practice? So I've outlined 4 or 5 key steps. One of them is trust and relationship building with Indigenous communities. I had the opportunity to catch up with some folks over some drinks last night and again today, and I'm hearing about really great success stories in the Yukon about the mining sector starting to engage with and partner with Indigenous communities from the onset of project development. I can't emphasize how important it is to build those relationships and build that trust right from the start. Not when you've got a fully developed plan for your mine, not when you've done all of the engineering work. Need to partner with Indigenous communities so that their values are incorporated from the onset of the development of your project. Of course, the requirement to obtain free, prior, informed consent. This is not a scary thing. It's happening in Canada. There are many, many, many examples where resource development companies have successfully obtained the free, prior, informed consent of Indigenous peoples. Need to ensure, number 4, that the projects are aligned with Indigenous values, decision-making, and priority. And we need to, again, partner with Indigenous people. And the best way to do that, from my experience, is equity participation in major projects. So I started speaking about this topic 5 or 6 years ago, and everybody in the room would kind of look at me like I was crazy when I said, we really need to move towards equity participation in major projects. That's no longer the case. This is happening, folks. It's happening across Canada, and it's happening with increased frequency. Just the number of announcements that we've had this year alone of major equity positions being taken by Indigenous people in major projects is mind-numbing. It's extraordinary. And what I've done, I don't have enough time to go through all of the examples, but I've shared my presentation with the conference organizers, and I'd be happy for them to send it out to you, because there's 6 or 7 great examples of First Nation equity ownership in transmission line, pipelines, liquefaction facilities. Of course, where possible, especially in Ontario, a lot of Indigenous ownership of renewable energy generation facilities, transmission lines, etc. So undeniably, there's this increasing trend towards Indigenous equity ownership of major projects. Now, what we're seeing here in that trend is that you can't adopt a one-size-fits-all approach. The approach is really going to be dependent on the nature of your project. So in the first sub-bullet point here, the timing of equity. So depending on the project, it may make sense for Indigenous peoples to become equity owners early on in the project. In some cases, the projects are too risky for Indigenous investment early on, and usually the investment occurs once the facility is brought, or the project is brought online. So we've seen a number of those types of deals, particularly with pipelines, transmission lines, etc. There's a lot of folks struggling with the second sub-bullet point, and what is the relationship between equity ownership and impact benefit agreements? So in a number of cases, the equity ownership is dealt with in the impact benefit agreement. There's some other examples where, for example, with the Coastal GasLink pipeline, TC Energy went out and obtained consent through impact benefit agreements of the 20 First Nations whose territories are going to be crossed by the Coastal GasLink pipeline, and then did a separate equity set-aside of 10%. So that the 20 First Nations were offered a 10% ownership in the transmission line, or in the pipeline, pardon me. So a lot of different sort of strategies that we're seeing there. A lot of variation in the quantum of equity. So we're seeing, like for example, in the Coastal GasLink pipeline, as I mentioned, 10%, all the way up to 50% or majority owned. I think the next wave of trend will be moving away from simple equity purchases to First Nations being the proponents of major projects moving forward in their territory. And we need to make sure that we're putting the right tools in place to empower First Nations to take that next step. Also seeing situations where equity is granted, i.e. provided to the nations at no cost as part of the accommodation for the impacts of their rights, and other situations where it's a purely business transaction. So I work on a number of these projects, including with the work that I do with the First Nations Major Projects Coalition. And I can tell you that the single largest obstacle or challenge right now that we're facing to achieve Indigenous equity of ownership of major projects is access to affordable capital. The single biggest issue. And this is really where governments can step up, and there's a very important role for governments to play. So those would include the federal, provincial, and territorial governments. We've seen a number of different programs across Canada that have tackled this issue successfully. So we had the feed-in tariff program in Ontario in the early 2010s that really catapulted a number of First Nations into significant equity ownership of new renewable energy generation facilities, so solar, wind, hydro facilities across the province. A number of folks have probably heard recent transactions being announced out of Alberta and the role that the AIOC plays in providing loan guarantees. For folks in the Yukon, my pitch to you is we really need a federal loan guarantee program to backstop First Nation equity ownership in major projects. There's currently a discussion happening across Canada that's being led by Natural Resources Canada. It's called the National Benefit Sharing Program. It's really important that everybody provide input into what NRCan is doing, because that is the best gateway right now that I can see to secure a federal loan guarantee program. But it's not just loan guarantees. First Nations are going to need different types of support and capacity building throughout the life cycle of project development. So whether it's just establishing the legal entity through which they're going to engage, doing feasibility or pre-feasibility studies all the way into the construction phase. And what we're seeing now is an increasing trend of governments stepping in and providing that support. But proponents, unfortunately, are not off the hook on this one too. There's a real role that proponents of major projects can play in facilitating equity ownership. And a number of the deals that I'm working on, the proponent is taking significant steps to address the lack of access to affordable capital and to de-risk the investment for the Indigenous peoples with whom they're doing business. Two more things, and then I think I'm going to run out of time here and probably get pulled off the stage. So second last thing, there's a tendency to pre-bake deals. I can't emphasize enough the need to avoid doing that, because generally speaking, what we're seeing is particularly coming out of Calgary, pre-baked deals that aren't going to facilitate First Nation equity ownership of major projects. They're not addressing the lack of access to affordable capital. They're not addressing the risk factors. They're not addressing other key concerns. And this is part of the paradigm shift that we're talking about. Sit down with your Indigenous partners and co-develop the basis for them to become equity owners in major projects. And that's really where you're going to get your success. It's going to reduce the amount of time required, and it's going to be a lot less frustrating for everybody. And I think you'll find if you do that, that type of engagement will be quite meaningful. Last point, the issue of equity ownership for First Nations is fundamental to the reconciliation project that we're carrying out here in Canada. Own source revenue going into First Nations is a key element of economic reconciliation and ensuring that Indigenous governments have the money to carry out core government services for their people, whether it's language revitalization, taking over child and family jurisdiction, dealing with health matters, rehabilitating the territory. These are all of the benefits that flow from significant equity participation in major projects. So I think I'll leave it at that. There's a number of slides towards the end of the slide deck where I've gone through individual projects and set out what the projects are about, how much equity was provided and the basis for that equity ownership. So I'll leave that with you, and thank you very much for having me, and I'll be around if you'd like to ask questions.